A fictional story. The snow did not fall that night. It hunted. It came sideways off the high country, driven and screaming, and somewhere in the heart of it, a girl was walking who should not have been alive, 18 years old, alone, in boots that had long ago stopped keeping out the cold. She had been told she would never last out here, that a girl like her was too small, too soft, too broken for a world this hard. And the mountain seemed to agree, because with every step, the dark pressed closer and the cold climbed higher up her legs, and the voice in her head whispered that this was where it ended. Then her foot went through the ice, and the water closed around it like a fist. She had minutes now, maybe less, and up the frozen slope, half buried in shadow, something was waiting. She clawed her way up out of the broken creek, and she knelt there in the dark, shaking, her breath tearing in and out of her. Her boot was full of water now, and she knew, the way she knew so many hard things, exactly what came next. First the burning, then the ache, and then the silence. When the foot stops sending word back, and the cold begins making its own decisions about what a body can afford to keep. Everything she owned hung off one shoulder in a canvas bag, a folding knife, half a box of crackers gone soft, a few coins that could not buy her warmth, or a door, or one kind word. She had come a long, hard way to end up freezing in the dark like this, a long way from the voices that had told her exactly what she was. Too small, too quiet, too breakable for a world this hard. She had turned her back on all of them and walked north, because north had felt more honest than going back ever could. And maybe they had been right about her. The mountains seemed to think so. It pressed close around her, black on black, the trees leaning in like things that were listening. The wind found every gap in her coat and pushed against her ribs. This cold climbed past her ankle and started up her shin. Cold like that is not a temperature. It is a decision the mountain makes about you. She had minutes. She knew that too. Maybe less. Shelter. Not soon. Now. She forced herself up off her knees, and she lifted her eyes to the dark hollow ahead, expecting nothing but more trees, more wind, more of the same long argument with the cold. And then she saw it. A straight line. Up the slope, half swallowed by shadow and snow, there was a straight line where no straight line should be. A corner. Walls meeting at a clean right angle. The shape of something built by human hands in the middle of a forest that had spent a long, long time trying to forget that human hands existed. A cabin. She stayed still for one breath. Then she rose, and she went toward it. Because whatever else this hard world had taught her, it had taught her this. When the dark offers you a door, you do not stop to ask why. The walls were old timber, notched and fitted at the corners the way things were built by people who had patience instead of money. The roof sagged but held. And the door was plain wood, hung on iron with a simple wooden latch on the outside. No lock. She stood in front of it, swaying a little, her wet foot already going silent inside the boot. A locked door means keep out, but a latch you can lift with one finger. A latch means something gentler. It means, maybe. She thought about what might wait inside a place left alone this long. The dark, the rot, some animal that had made the silence its own. Her hand hovered over the latch, trembling, and the wind shoved at her back as if it had already decided for her. She lifted the latch, and the smell that came out was not the smell of ruin. It was old wood, and wood smoke gone so deep into the grain it had become part of the grain itself. And under that, something almost sweet. Dried herbs, maybe. Cedar. The smell of a place that had been lived in hard and then left with care. She stepped inside, out of the wind, and for the first time in longer than she could say, the wind could not reach her. She pulled a small flashlight from her coat, and her cold fingers fumbled it twice before the beam came on. The light swept the room the way a frightened person looks at a new place. Floor first, then the corners, then the things that matter most. The floor was solid under her weight. The ceiling was low, the rafters close. And in the far corner, there was a small iron stove. She crossed to it in 3 steps, knelt, pulled open the little door of the firebox, half expecting to find it choked with ash and ruin. It was clean, swept clean. Someone had emptied that stove down to the bare iron before they left it. No ash, no mess, nothing. Except one thing. Resting on the grate, alone, perfectly placed, was a single curl of birch bark. She stared at it for a long moment, and something in her chest went very quiet. Because birch bark is not something the forest leaves behind by accident. Birch bark is the one thing that catches from a single match, even after it has sat dry for years. You do not drop it on a grate by chance. You place it there, on purpose, with your own hands. You place it there because you know that someday, someone will come in out of the cold, half frozen, and out of hope, and you want that someone to have fire within a minute of needing it. She sat back on her heels in the dark. Somebody had thought of her. Not her, exactly. They could never have known her name, or her face, or the long cold road that had brought her here. But they had thought of someone lost, someone shivering, someone the world had decided would not last. And they had left the fire ready. Her eyes filled, and she did not let the tears fall, because tears freeze out here. And because she had learned a long time ago to spend them carefully. But her hands were shaking now for a reason that had nothing to do with the cold. She looked closer. Beneath the birch bark, laid with quiet care, there were thin shavings of cedar. And beneath those, 2 slim pieces of soft wood. And beneath those, a single split of hardwood. Dark and dense, aged to the color of old leather. It was not just a fire someone had left behind. It was a fire someone had built. For a stranger they would never meet. A fire laid the way you lay it when you want the next person to understand something. That they were expected, that they were not, after all, completely alone. She reached into her shirt pocket, where she kept a small book of matches dry against her skin, and she pulled one free. Her thumb found the strike, and she paused, just for a moment, and looked around at this small, still room that had been waiting in the dark of the mountain for someone exactly like her to walk in out of the storm. The wind howled against the walls. It could not get in. She struck the match. The little flame trembled to life, gold in all that dark, and she held it to the corner of the birch bark and watched the oil in that paper-thin curl catch the way it always does. A brief hesitation, and then a decision. The bark curled, caught, glowed, and the smallest light in the world began to spread through that forgotten cabin in the snow. She did not know yet whose hands had built this fire for her. She did not know the name written in the worn old book waiting on the shelf above her head, or the long story it would tell her, or how much that quiet, patient voice would change everything about the girl she was going to become. She only knew this. For the first time in a very long time, somebody had left a light on, and she was warm. The fire grew slowly, the way good fires do, not all at once, not with a roar, just a patient widening of light. The birch bark passing its small flame to the cedar handing it gently to the soft pale wood, and the soft wood, at last, giving it over to that single dark split of oak. She watched the whole thing happen on her knees, the way a person watches something they are almost afraid to interrupt. And as the first true heat began to reach her face, she finally let herself feel how cold she had truly been. That is the strange mercy of warmth. You do not know how frozen you have been until something begins to thaw you. She stayed there a long moment, letting the glow find the hollows of her cheeks, the chapped backs of her hands, the raw place at her wrists where the wind had gotten under her sleeves. And then she made herself turn to the thing that frightened her most, her foot. She sat down on the rough wooden floor with her back against the warm iron flank of the stove, and she began to work the wet boot loose. The laces had frozen stiff at the hooks. Her fingers were clumsy and pale, and they did not want to obey her, so she worked them slowly, one hook at a time, careful, the way you'd handle something that might come apart in your hands. When the boot finally pulled free, she set it carefully aside, and she peeled off the soaked wool sock beneath it. And then she just looked at the foot for a moment, without touching it. The two smallest toes had gone the color of a bruised plum, deep, dark purple at the very tips, fading back through an angry red toward something almost ordinary near the arch. She knew enough to be afraid. But she also knew that white would have been worse. White is the color of a thing already surrendered. This was not white. This was a foot still arguing for itself, still holding on. She pressed one fingertip gently against the smallest toe, and there was feeling there. Dull, distant, like pressing through a thick winter glove. But it was there. She let out a slow breath through her nose, and she did the only thing she could think to do. She cupped that cold foot in both her warm hands, and she tucked it up against the inside of her thigh, and she held it. The way you would hold a small, frightened creature that had wandered in out of a storm. And she waited. Outside, the wind kept up its long, low complaint. It searched the corners of the cabin. It found a thin gap somewhere near the north wall and made a high, lonesome whistle of it. The whole little room seemed to listen to it, but the wind could not get to her. That was the whole of it in that moment. The one fact she could hold on to. The wind could not get to her. The feeling came back into her toes in slow, burning waves. And it was a misery she found herself grateful for. Because pain meant living tissue. Pain meant the foot was still hers. Numbness was the thing to fear. Numbness was the cold making decisions on her behalf. So she sat with the burning, and she breathed through it, and she let her stubborn body do its quiet work. And while she waited, she let her eyes begin to learn the room. In the steady glow of the fire, the cabin no longer looked like a ruin. It looked cared for. The walls were old timber, the gaps between the logs packed long ago with some mixture of clay and dry moss. Most of it had held. Here and there, a piece had crumbled away in an upper corner, and that was where the drafts came whispering through. But the bones of the place were sound. A path was worn into the floorboards, smooth and pale and shallow. It ran between the stove and the door and the long shelf on the far wall. The kind of smoothness that only comes from the same 2 feet walking the same short line, day after day, season after season, for more years than a young person can easily imagine. She found that path strangely moving. Someone had lived a whole quiet life in the space of those few steps. A narrow bunk was built against one wall. A thin mattress, stuffed with something that had long ago compressed down to almost nothing. A folded wool blanket on top, gray, gone soft and thin at the edges, with a single moth-eaten corner. This was not a place someone had merely passed through. This was a place someone had lived. And there is a difference you can feel in a room before you can put it into words. An empty place that was only ever visited has a flat, passive kind of silence. But a room that was truly lived in pushes back at you. It still holds the shape of the person who shaped it. This one pushed back. Above the bunk ran the long shelf, fixed to the logs with iron brackets that someone had hammered out by hand. She could tell by the way they weren't quite even, weren't quite matched. Nothing that comes off a machine is ever that gently imperfect. On the shelf sat a few glass jars with their lids still screwed on tight. A tin can. A folded square of cloth, yellowed with age. And a chipped enamel cup with its handle broken clean away. The break old and smooth. In the corner, leaning against the wall, there was an axe. She noticed it the way you notice a thing that has been looked after. The handle had been refitted at some point, the wood newer than the head, and a band of copper wire had been wound tight just below the steel to keep the head from working loose, to keep it from walking up the handle over the long swings of long winters. Someone had cared about that axe. Someone had wired it and sharpened it and set it back in its corner where it could be found. You do not do that to a tool you mean to abandon. You do that to a tool you are leaving for someone else. And at the very end of the shelf, leaning into the corner at a slight angle, there was a book. Not a new book. Not a bright one. An old one. Hardbound, the cover worn to the color of river mud, its spine cracked from years of being opened and shut. A thin strip of leather had been wound around it twice and tied off in a simple knot. The kind of knot a person ties when they expect to untie it again themselves. Not a knot meant to seal a thing away forever. She did not reach for it yet. She had learned, somewhere along her hard road, to wait out the part of herself that wanted to grab and tear and rush. The cold makes a person greedy. It makes you want to take everything at once. But taking, done carelessly, is how careless people get themselves hurt. So first, she finished thawing her foot. She worked the warmth back into each toe with her thumbs, slow and patient, until the deep plum purple faded toward red, and the red faded toward something that looked like it might forgive her. She flexed the toes, one by one. They answered her, stiff and sore and reluctant. But they answered. She had kept her foot. She let herself feel that small victory for exactly as long as it took to draw one breath. And then she pulled the dry enough sock back on, and she rose, and she crossed the small room to the shelf, and she lifted that old book down with both hands. It was heavier than it looked. The leather strip was dry under her fingers, almost chalky with age and cold. She worked the knot loose slowly, the way you'd untie something that someone else had once tied with care. And she could not have told you why it mattered that she be gentle with it. But it did matter. She felt that, even if she could not say it. The cover opened with a soft creak, like a door in a house where someone has been sleeping. And there, on the very first page, was handwriting, small, upright, written with a pencil that had been kept very sharp. Not the loose, hurried scrawl of a person scribbling only for themselves, but the careful, deliberate hand of someone who had decided that what they were setting down deserved to be read by someone else, by someone who was not yet there. She held her breath without quite knowing why, because that one choice, the choice to write clearly, to shape each letter so a stranger could follow it, told her something before she had read a single line. The pages spoke of a man who had climbed up to this high, forgotten place on foot, carrying weeks of supplies on his back, leaving the noise of the lower world behind him on purpose. A man who had come up the mountain not so much running from something as walking slowly toward something quieter. The early pages told of his first days, the hard wind out of the northwest, the cold that dropped between noon and dark like a stone falling down a well, the soft boards along the roof that needed mending before any real snow could come. And then, near the bottom of one of those early pages, set apart from everything around it, written just a little larger than the rest, were a few words. A good place to think. She read that line twice. She could not have told you why it landed in her chest the way it did. Maybe because no one had ever offered her a place to think. No one had ever once behaved as though she might have thoughts worth the room to have them. She turned the page. He wrote of the work, of mending what was broken, of where the axe was kept, and how to hold its edge against the whetstone, of the creek running clear in the gray morning, and the way the late light slid down the far ridge in the long afternoons. He wrote like a man at peace, but it was the next thing she found that made her go entirely still, because the man had not written these pages only for himself. Tucked in among the careful instructions, the where and the how, and the why of every repair, there ran a second voice, a voice speaking gently to someone he knew he would never meet. Whoever finds this, the words seemed to say, you are welcome here. The fire is laid. The roof will hold if you tend it. The water can be made to run again if you have the patience for it. Take what you need, and when you go, at last, leave it ready for the next one. She lowered the book slowly into her lap, and for a long moment, she simply sat in the firelight in that small warm room on the cold dark mountain and tried to take in what she was holding. This man, whoever he had been, had not closed up this cabin and walked off with a careless hand. He had closed it the way you close a thing for someone else. He had swept that stove clean down to the bare iron, and he had laid a fire on the grate, not for himself, but for a stranger he would never know. He had wired the handle of his axe and set it in the corner where it could be found. He had left his tar in the tin and his words in the book, and his blanket folded square on the bunk, and he had done all of it with one quiet, impossible kindness in his heart, that whoever came next, whoever stumbled half frozen out of a storm, would find that someone had gone before them, that they had been thought of, that they were expected, that they were not, in the end, alone. She pressed the heel of her hand hard against her eyes, because no one had ever done that for her. Not in the warm world below, not in the houses with their locked doors and their tight, careful mouths, not from any of the people who had looked at her and seen only a girl too small, too quiet, too poor, and too plain to ever amount to anything at all, but a stranger she would never meet. A man long gone from this mountain had somehow reached across all that distance and all that time and left a light burning for her. She turned gently toward the back of the book, fanning through page after page of that small, patient hand, and she found that he had not filled it all. Somewhere along the way, the entries simply stopped. Whole pages at the end stood empty and waiting, as if, at some point, the man had decided he no longer needed to translate the place into words, as if he had finally just lived in it, quiet and unhurried, with nothing left over that needed explaining. She closed the cover, soft as a held breath, and she held the book against her chest, both arms wrapped around it, the way a child holds the one thing in all the world that is truly only theirs. The voice in those pages was not loud. It did not shout or promise or demand a single thing of her. It simply stayed. And for a girl who had spent so long with no voice for company but the cruel ones, that quiet, steady presence was almost more than she knew how to carry. She had not always been alone. That was the part that hurt the most, if she let herself drift too near it. There had been, once, a woman who raised her. An old woman with rough, warm hands and a low, slow way of speaking, who had taken in a child that nobody else seemed to have any use for, and had simply, stubbornly, kept her. That woman had taught her things. How to mend what was torn instead of throwing it out. How to coax a flame from damp and stubborn wood. How to read the evening sky for tomorrow's weather and the silence of a room for the trouble in it. How to work with her two hands until the work itself became a kind of quiet prayer, a thing that held you together when nothing else would. You're stronger than they think, the old woman used to tell her in the lamplight on the nights when the world had been unkind. You just don't know it yet. And the girl had believed her, because the old woman had never once lied to her. Not about anything, not even the hard things. But the world is not gentle with the people who hold us up. And when that warm, rough hand finally went still, when the low, slow voice fell quiet for the very last time, the girl found herself standing in a world that suddenly seemed to have no more use for her at all. The people who came afterward did not look at her the way the old woman had. They looked at her the way you look at a problem to be solved. A girl with no money, no standing, no one left to speak for her. She had stood in a narrow hallway and listened, through a half-closed door, as those people decided among themselves exactly who she was. She won't last on her own. A girl like that. There's just nothing in her. Give it a month. She'll come crawling back. And the worst of it, the part that had followed her all the way up the mountain and into the killing snow, was not their plain cruelty. It was that some small, frightened, tired part of her had begun, quietly, to believe them. Maybe they were right. Maybe she really was too soft for a world this hard. Maybe the only person who had ever looked at her and seen something strong had been one old woman who was gone now, and who could never be asked again. So she had done the one thing none of them expected. She had gathered the few things that were truly hers, and she had walked out the door, and she had turned her back on every last one of them. Not because she was brave, but because staying had begun to feel like a slow kind of vanishing, like being erased one small word at a time. She would rather be lost out in the honest cold than be made small in all that false warmth. And the cold had very nearly taken her for the choice. But now she sat in a stranger's cabin with a stranger's kindness laid out gently all around her, with a stranger's quiet voice resting open in her lap. And for the first time since the old woman's hand went still, she did not feel alone. She wiped her face with the back of her wrist. She drew a long breath, and she set her grief down carefully, where she knew she could pick it up again later, because grief is patient and it always waits. Then she made herself look at the room with clear, dry eyes, because being moved by a thing and surviving it are not the same. Kindness had given her a fire and a roof and a voice in the dark, but the mountain was not finished with her yet. She felt the next trouble before she understood it. A cold breath rising up through the floorboards near the center of the room. She knelt and she set her palm flat against the wood, and there it was, a soft place, a faint give to it that the rest of the floor did not have. Not quite rot, not yet, but the slow beginning of it. She frowned and she lifted her eyes to follow that cold straight up. The stovepipe rose from the iron stove and passed through the low ceiling through a thin collar of sheet metal, and there, where the pipe met the roof, in the wavering reach of the firelight, she could just make out the trouble. The collar had pulled away on the uphill side, lifted over long, slow years by the heave of frost and the endless quarrel between heat and cold. And through that one small lifted seam, no wider than a finger, the weather had been finding its patient way inside. Not through the shingles, not through the ridge, through that single inch of open seam. Every snowmelt, every storm, every thaw that had ever come to this mountain, for more years than she could begin to count, had been wicking quietly down along that pipe, running across the top of the warm stove, and soaking, drop by patient drop, down into the boards beneath. That was the soft place under her hand. That was the cold breath in the floor. And if she did nothing, if she simply curled herself up in that gray wool blanket and let the fire burn down and told herself it was somebody else's problem to fix, the water would keep coming. The rot would keep spreading quietly, the way rot always does. And one cold gray morning, sooner than she would like, the very heart of this little shelter would give way beneath her weight. The kindness of a stranger had carried her this far, but kindness, she was beginning to understand, is not the same thing as safety. Kindness lays the fire. You still have to keep it burning. And there was a colder worry waiting just behind that one, because she had seen, when she first stumbled in, the thin and nearly empty look of her own supplies, the crackers gone soft in her bag. the little that remained of what she had carried up the long road. She had food for a day, perhaps. 2, if she stretched it. And she had always known how to stretch a thing. After that, this cabin would have to feed her, or it would not. She pushed that thought down to wait with the others, and she turned back to the enemy she could actually fight tonight. The seam, the cold, the slow water working its way into the bones of the place. And almost without thinking, her hand reached again for the book, because some part of her had already begun, quietly, to trust it. She turned the worn pages by firelight, her eyes moving down that careful hand, and it did not take her long to find what she had hoped for, because of course the man had known. Of course he had. A person who would lay a fire for a stranger is a person who thinks ahead, a person who plans for the trouble he won't be there to see. There, on one of the soft and dog-eared pages, in that same patient pencil, were instructions for this very thing. The collar will lift, the words warned her. It always does. Watch the seam where the pipe meets the roof. When the floor goes soft beneath the stove, the seam is the reason for it. Seal it before you trust those boards again. And below that, almost as an afterthought, one more line. There is tar in the tin, on the shelf, kept for exactly this. Use what you need, and then leave some behind, for the one who comes after you. Her eyes lifted slowly to the shelf, to the tin can sitting there, just where the man had said it would be. And she understood then something that ran far deeper than tar and seams and soft floorboards. She understood that she had not simply been lucky. She had been provided for by a man who had imagined her without ever once laying eyes on her, who had pictured someone exactly like her, lost and frozen and doubted by everyone she'd left behind, climbing up out of the dark and into his careful little room, and who had said, with every quiet choice he made, in a voice she could almost hear now in the snap of the fire, Here is what you'll need. Now do the work." She crossed to the shelf and took the tin down. The roofing tar inside had hardened to a crust around the rim over the long years, but at its center, when she pressed her thumb to it, it was still soft, still dark, still workable, left ready, just as he had promised. She worked a fist-sized piece loose with a sliver of wood from the box beside the stove, and she gathered her courage, because the seam was high, in the cold dark near the ceiling, and her hands were still half clumsy with the night's chill, and the old whisper was already starting up again in the back of her mind, the voice of every person who had ever decided who she was. "You can't do this. You don't have it in you. A girl like you." But this time, there was another voice in the room, a quieter one, a steadier one, the voice of a stranger in a worn old book who had never known her name and had believed in her anyway. "The roof will hold, if you tend it." She tightened her cold fingers around the soft, dark tar, and she dragged the single wooden chair across the floor to stand beneath the lifted seam, and she set her jaw exactly the way the old woman used to set hers. Then she climbed up. The cold was sharper near the ceiling, where the warmth of the fire could not reach. She had to stretch onto her toes, the chair wobbling beneath her. One hand braced flat against a cold roof board for balance, while the other worked the tar up into the open seam. It was slow, awkward, miserable work. The tar fought her. Her shoulders burned. Twice the chair shifted under her, and her stomach dropped, and she had to go still and breathe until it steadied. But she pressed the tar in, and she worked it deep into the gap with her thumb, the way the book had told her, sealing the seam an inch at a time, pushing the cold back out into the night where it belonged. And when the last of the open seam disappeared beneath the dark tar, the thin whistle of weather that had been seeping in went quiet. The room changed, not warmer, not yet, but stiller. A held breath finally let go. She climbed down off the chair on shaking legs, and she stood there in the firelight with tar on her fingers and ache in her shoulders, and she looked up at the work she had done. The seam sealed, the cold turned back, the heart of the little cabin made sound again, at least for tonight. She had done it. The girl no one believed in. She had kept the roof, and though she did not know it yet, could not have known it, sitting alone in that small, bright room while the dark gathered itself outside, the mountain was not done with her. Far off, beyond the sealed seam and the warm walls, and the patient old voice resting open on the bunk, something colder than any night so far was beginning, slowly, to turn its face toward the hollow. But for now, for this one hard-won night, the girl had a fire at her back, a roof above her head, and a voice in her hands that told her, gently, over and over, that she was stronger than they had ever thought. She just hadn't known it yet. Now, slowly, she was beginning to. The days that followed taught her the shape of the place. She learned its sounds, the way the fire settled in the night with a soft collapse of embers, the way the wind changed its voice depending on which corner it found, the slow tick of the stovepipe cooling, the particular silence of deep snow, which is not really silence at all, but a kind of held breath the whole world takes together. She learned the work, too, how to bank the fire low at night, so it would last until morning without pulling cold air down the chimney, how to melt snow in the chipped enamel pot, a little at a time, because snow gives back less water than you'd ever believe, how to move slowly in the cold, so she wouldn't sweat, because sweat freezes, and a wet shirt out here is a quiet kind of enemy. The book taught her most of it. She kept it close now, on the bunk while she slept, in the chest pocket of her coat while she worked. Each morning she would open it and read a little, and each time she found that the man had already walked the road ahead of her, and had left small marks along the way to show where the footing was bad. Lay the fire before you need it. Move slow. The mountain has no patience for hurry. When your hands won't work, warm them before you trust them with anything sharp. She did not know his name. He had never written it down. A man writing only for strangers, it seemed, had felt no need to introduce himself. But she had begun, in the quiet of her own mind, to think of him simply as the one who came before. And she had begun, without quite deciding to talk to him. Not out loud, not at first, just a thought, tossed up toward the rafters while she worked. Like this? Is this how you meant it? And the strange thing, the thing she would never have admitted to a single soul down in the warm world below, was that it helped. For the first time in a very long time, the silence in a room did not feel like a verdict. It felt like company. But the mountain, for all its quiet, was keeping a secret. She felt it before she understood it. One gray afternoon, she stepped outside to gather snow, and she stopped on the worn threshold, and she went very still. Something had changed. The wind had dropped to nothing. The trees stood perfectly silent under their white burden. No bird called. No branch creaked. Even the creek, somewhere down the slope, seemed to be running softer than before. The whole hollow had gone still, not the gentle stillness of an ordinary winter evening, a waiting stillness, the kind of stillness that comes over a room when everyone in it knows something is about to be said, and no one wants to be the one to say it. She looked up at the sky. It had gone the color of old iron. A low ceiling of cloud had come down over the ridge while she wasn't watching, swallowing the peaks, pressing close over the tops of the trees. And on the cold air there was a smell she did not have a name for. A sharp mineral smell. The smell of something enormous gathering itself far away and turning slowly to face her. She did not need a book to tell her what it meant. The old woman had taught her this one herself, long ago, in another life. When the world goes quiet like this, it is not resting. It is bracing. She did not waste the warning. She filled every container she had with snow and set it near the stove to melt. She brought in wood until the pile along the inside wall stood high, and the supply outside grew thin. She checked the sealed seam and the chinking in the corners and the latch on the door. She tucked the man's book deep in the dry warmth of her coat, and then she sat by the fire, and she waited. The storm came down off the high country a little after dark. It did not arrive the way ordinary weather arrives. It came like something that had been sent. First, the wind returned, but changed. No longer the lonesome, searching whistle of the past nights. This was a low, building roar, a great voice rising in the dark beyond the walls, and behind it came the snow, driven sideways, flung against the cabin in long, hissing waves that sounded almost like the sea. The little fire shuddered in its iron box. The flame leaned and guttered, and she fed it carefully, coaxing it back the way you'd shield a candle in a draught with your cupped hand. The cold came in behind the wind. She could feel it pressing at the walls, testing every seam, every gap, every place where the warmth had grown comfortable. The temperature in the little room began, slowly, to slide. She pulled the wool blanket around her shoulders and kept feeding the fire and watched her breath begin to show again in the cooling air. The wind found the roof and worried at it. She heard the tin sheeting strain against its nails, a high creaking complaint, and she sat with her eyes fixed upward and her heart in her throat, waiting to hear something tear loose. But the work she had done held. The sealed seam held. The roof took the wind's first great shove and stayed where it was. She let out a breath she did not know she'd been holding. This is what you meant, she thought, up toward the unseen man who had built this place. This is what all the careful work was for, not for the easy nights, for this one. The storm built through the early dark, and just when she thought it had shown her the worst of itself, it knocked. 3 blows on the plank door. Heavy, slow, final. She froze where she sat. For one wild moment her mind told her it was only the wind, only a branch flung against the wood. But the wind does not knock 3 times and then wait. It knocked again, and a voice came through the storm, a man's voice, rough and frayed at the edges by the cold, shouting to be heard above the roar. "Open the door!" She did not move. Every hard lesson the lower world had ever taught her rose up at once. A locked door is no door at all if you open it. A girl alone, in the dark, in a place no one knows, does not simply lift the latch for a stranger in the storm. "I know somebody's in there," the voice came again. "There's smoke. Open the door before we both freeze." Her eyes went to the axe in the corner, then to the latch, and then against everything the warm world had ever beaten into her. She thought of a single line in the worn old book, a line she had read a dozen times without quite understanding it. "When the dark sends someone to your door," the man had written, "remember that it once sent you." Her hand was shaking, but she crossed the room and she lifted the latch. The door swung in on a blast of wind and snow, and a man came through it sideways, half falling, dragging a curtain of cold into the room with him. She shoved the door shut behind him with her whole weight, and threw the latch, and turned. And there he stood, a big man, broad through the shoulders, gone gray beneath a snow-crusted cap. His face was weathered to leather by a lifetime out of doors, and there were hard lines around his mouth that looked like they had been carved there by years of not smiling. Snow melted off his coat and pooled on the worn floorboards. He looked at her, and whatever he had expected to find in this cabin, it was plainly not a girl of 18, wrapped in a dead man's blanket, standing her ground in the firelight. "You," he said. Just that, as if the single word were an accusation. She lifted her chin and said nothing. He looked around the room, slowly, and she watched his expression change as he did. The hardness in it cracked, just slightly, into something that might have been confusion or grief. He took in the fire, the sealed seam, the wood stacked high along the wall, the chipped pot of melting snow, and then his eyes found the book on the bunk, and he went still. "Where did you get that?" he said. His voice had dropped. It wasn't a shout anymore. It was something quieter and far more dangerous. "It was here," she said, her first words to him. "I found it here. Everything here was already here." He crossed the room in 2 strides and stood over the bunk, looking down at the worn old book as though it were a face he had not seen in a very long time. He did not touch it. His hands stayed at his sides, and she saw that they had curled into fists. "You shouldn't be here," he said at last. "I had nowhere else." "That's not what I mean." He turned to look at her, and there was something raw working behind his eyes now. "This place. You shouldn't be in this place. A girl like you, alone, up here, in the teeth of a winter like this one. You don't have the first idea what this mountain can do." There it was, the old verdict. The same word she had heard through a half-closed door in another life, dressed up now in a stranger's frost-rimed coat. A girl like you. Something in her went very still and very cold, colder than the storm. "You don't know the first thing about me," she said. "I know you're 18, if that," he said. "I know you've got no business out here. I know this storm is going to sit on this hollow for days, and I know people far stronger than you have died in cabins just like this one, with the fire still burning, because they made one small mistake when it counted." He shook his head. "You should have stayed wherever you came from. There was nothing to stay for." The words came out flat and quiet, and they landed harder than she meant them to. The man looked at her for a long moment, and something in his weathered face shifted. "No," he said finally, almost to himself. "No, I don't suppose there was." He turned away from her then, and he set one heavy hand against the timber wall, and he bowed his head. And for a moment the only sound in the room was the great roar of the storm flinging itself against the walls. When he spoke again, his voice had changed completely. "You want to know how I knew there'd be smoke up here?" he said. "How I knew to come." She said nothing. She waited. "Because a long time ago," he said slowly, "more years back than you've been alive, child, I was the one half frozen in the dark, climbing this slope, sure I was going to die on it. Stupider than you, for certain. I'd gone up into this country thinking it owed me something, and it taught me different, the way it teaches everybody different." He let out a breath. "And I found this cabin, just like you did, with a fire already laid, and a door with no lock, and a man inside who didn't ask me a single question." Her heart had begun to pound. "His name was Amos," the man said. Amos. The name went through her like a struck note. The one who came before. The patient hand. The quiet voice in the worn old book that had kept her company through the long cold nights. Amos. "He took me in," the man went on, and his voice had gone rough in a different way now. "Fed me, thawed me out, didn't lecture, didn't judge, just kept me alive, the way this place is built to keep people alive. And when the weather broke and it was time for me to go, he didn't ask for anything. Not money. Not thanks. He just said..." The man stopped. His jaw worked. He just said, "Leave it ready for the next one." The wind screamed against the cabin. The fire popped and hissed. And the big weathered man stood in the firelight with his head bowed, carrying something she was only beginning to understand. A weight he had hauled up this mountain along with himself. "And I never did," he said. The words were barely above a whisper. He kept this place going for years after that. And then one hard winter he was gone, and there was no one left to keep it but me. And I never came. He shook his head slowly. Year after year, I told myself I would. And the years went the way they do. I let this place fall to the weather and the dark, and I let his work rot. And I let a debt I could never repay just sit there, unpaid. He lifted his head and looked at her, and there was no hardness left in his face now, only an old, tired grief, and something that looked almost like shame. "So when I saw smoke coming up out of this hollow tonight," he said, "I figured it was kids, or a fool, somebody who'd freeze before morning and leave me one more thing I should have done and didn't." He shook his head slowly. "I came up here ready to drag somebody back down the mountain by the collar, not to find..." He didn't finish. He didn't have to. She understood now, the look on his face when he'd first seen the room. The fire tended, the seam sealed, the wood stacked high, and the book kept close and dry. He had come up the mountain expecting to find the dead man's work in ruins, and instead, he had found it, carried on, by a girl he had taken one look at and written off. A girl like you. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The storm raged. The fire burned. And the two of them stood on either side of the small, bright room, a man who had failed a kindness, and a girl who had been doubted her whole life, with the patient voice of a dead man resting open on the bunk between them. "It's not going to let up," the man said at last, nodding toward the wall, toward the roaring dark beyond it. "Not tonight. Maybe not for days. A storm sits down in this country. It doesn't get up in a hurry." "I know," she said. "That means you're stuck with me." He said it like a warning. "And I'm stuck with you. And this cabin's got to carry the both of us through whatever's coming, which means it's got to hold." "It'll hold," she said. He looked at her. There was doubt in it still. Old habit. The reflex of a man who had spent his whole life expecting the worst, and being proven right just often enough to keep believing it. "You don't know that," he said. "No," she agreed quietly, "but I know how to make it likelier." And she turned away from him, and she knelt at the stove, and she began to do the work. She fed the fire carefully, reading the draw of it, keeping it hot enough to hold the cold at bay, but not so hot it would pull the storm down the chimney. She checked the corners for the places where the wind was beginning to find its way back in, and she packed them tight. She moved through the small room with the slow, sure economy the old woman had taught her, and the book had deepened, doing each small thing in its right order, wasting nothing. And the man stood back against the wall and watched her. He said nothing for a long while, but she could feel him watching, could feel the slow, grudging turn of something behind his weathered face. Because she did not panic. She did not freeze. She did not look to him to save her. She simply knew what to do, and she did it. The storm leaned harder against the cabin as the night deepened. The wind found a new voice, higher and colder, and the temperature in the little room slid lower despite the fire, until even the flames seemed to be losing ground. And then she heard it, a new sound over by the north wall, a faint, ticking trickle. She went still, and she listened, and her stomach dropped. Somewhere in the corner, under the relentless push of the storm, the cold had found a weakness she hadn't sealed. A thin finger of melt was working its way in along a log, beginning to darken the wood below, beginning the same slow, patient ruin that had nearly hollowed out the floor before her. The man heard it too. He pushed off the wall. "That's it starting," he said grimly. "That's how it goes. One small place, then another. Then the cold's inside with you, and you can't get warm no matter how high you build the fire. And then nothing," she said. She was already moving. She crossed to the shelf, and she took down the tin of tar, and she pulled a fistful of the dry moss chinking from a spare bundle she had set aside days ago against exactly this kind of night. She knelt at the north wall, found the cold seeping seam with her fingers, and began to work. The man watched her do it. He watched her pack the gap and seal it, and turn the cold back out into the dark where it belonged, with hands that did not shake now, in a room she had clearly made her own. And slowly the trickle stopped. The cold drew back. The fire, given the room to do its work, steadied and climbed. She sat back on her heels, breathing hard, and she looked up at the man, at the doubt in his face giving way, against his will, to something that looked almost like wonder. "Amos taught you well," he said quietly. "He never met me," she said. "No." The man looked at the worn old book on the bunk, and then back at her, and something in his eyes had gone soft and strange. No, he never did. Outside, the storm howled on, gathering itself for the long dark hours still to come. But inside the small bright cabin, the fire held, the walls held, and the girl no one had ever believed in knelt in the firelight beside a man who had stopped, at last, telling her what she could not do, and had begun, instead, to watch what she could. The storm did not pass. It settled. It came down over the hollow like something that had decided to stay, and it made itself at home in the dark beyond the walls, and it did not move on. Hour gave way to hour. The gray light that crept through the small window each morning was so thin and so brief that the two of them lost track of whether it was truly day at all. And in that small bright room, the girl and the weathered man learned slowly how to share a space. It was not friendship. Not at first. It was something more careful than that. The wary, watchful truce of two people who have nothing in common but a fire and a roof and a storm that wants them both. He kept to his side of the room. She kept to hers. But the cabin was small, and the work of staying alive in it was constant, and you cannot keep up a wall against another person forever when you are both bent over the same fire, feeding it the same wood, watching the same flame stand between you and the dark. She learned a few things about him in those long hours, that he had spent his whole life in high, hard country, that he had buried more people than he liked to count, friends caught out in weather just like this one, that he had come up the mountain tonight on instinct and stubbornness, the way he seemed to do most things without nearly enough preparation, sure he could handle whatever he found, that he was a man who had spent decades being the strong one, the one who came to the rescue, the one others leaned on, and that there was something in him underneath all that hard, weathered strength that had been quietly breaking for a long, long time. He learned a few things about her, too. He learned, watching her work, that the careful way she moved through the cold was not luck. He learned that she rationed without being told to, that she banked the fire by feel, that she read the wind's changing voice the way other people read a clock. "Where'd a girl your age learn all this?" he asked her once, gruffly, from his side of the room. She did not look up from the fire. "From someone who believed in me," she said, "and from him." She nodded at the worn old book on the bunk. "The one who came before." The man was quiet for a while after that. "Amos," he said finally, just the name, like a man laying down something heavy he'd been carrying too long. "You keep saying it like it hurts," she said. He did not answer, but she saw the way his jaw worked and the way his eyes went to the book and then quickly away from it, as though it were a thing he could not quite bear to look at directly. The cold deepened as the storm wore on. It was a patient cold. It did not announce itself. It simply pressed in a little harder with each passing hour, leaning on the walls, searching for any small mistake, any moment of carelessness, any seam left unsealed. She kept ahead of it. She kept the fire fed and the corners packed, and the blanket where it would do the most good. She melted snow in the chipped pot, a little at a time, and she made sure the man drank his share even when he waved it off. But somewhere in the long heart of that endless night, she began to notice that something was wrong with him. It was small at first. He had stopped complaining. A man like that, who had grumbled and doubted and warned her of disaster from the moment he came through the door, had gone quiet, too quiet. He sat slumped against the timber wall, and his head had begun to nod. And when she spoke to him, it took him a beat too long to answer. "You need to come closer to the fire," she told him. "I'm fine," he muttered. "Tend your own self." But he was not fine. She crossed to him and crouched down and looked at him properly, and what she saw frightened her more than the storm. His weathered face had gone a strange waxy gray. His shivering, which had been hard and constant when he first stumbled in, had begun to ease. And she knew from the old woman's teaching, from the careful pages of the book, that a body that stops fighting the cold is not a body that has won. It is a body that has begun to give up. The climb had taken more out of him than he would admit. The years had taken more than he would admit. He had come up this mountain to save somebody, the way he always did, and he had not saved enough of himself to make it back down. "You stubborn old fool," she said softly. It was not unkind. It was almost tender. She got him closer to the stove. She wrapped the wool blanket around his shoulders, the dead man's blanket, and she built the fire up as high as she dared. And then she reached for the pot of melted snow to get something warm into him, and she found it nearly empty. She stood there for a moment, the cold reality settling over her. Snow gives back so little water. It always had. And melting it took time, and time took fire, and fire took wood. And the woodpile, high as she had built it, would not last forever against a storm like this with two people to keep alive instead of one. She could not melt enough snow fast enough to carry them both through. She needed water, real water, more than the cold and the snow would give her. And there was none. She knelt there in the firelight with the empty pot in her hands, and the gray-faced man fading beside her, and she felt the old whisper rise up in the back of her mind, the cruelest voice she knew. "You can't do this. You're going to watch him slip away, and you won't be able to stop it. A girl like you." But she had learned, by now, to answer that voice, and she answered it the only way she knew how. She reached for the book. Her cold fingers turned the worn pages by firelight, faster now, searching, and she did not even fully know what she was looking for until she found it. A page she had read before, days ago, without understanding why it might matter. A page about water. The man who came before had faced this too. Of course he had. A man could not live a whole quiet life up here on snowmelt alone. And there, in that careful, patient hand, was the answer he had left her. "There is a spring," the page said, 2/3 of the way up the ridge. "The water there runs clear and slow, even in the deep cold, because it comes up from below the place the frost can reach. A line runs from that spring down to the cabin, buried deep, below the frost, so that even when the whole world freezes over, the water still comes. The pump on the east wall draws it." She looked up. There, on the east wall, where she had taken it for some piece of old broken machinery, was a hand pump, rusted, silent, connected, she had thought, to nothing at all. She turned back to the page. "The line will be dry now," the words warned her, "if no one has worked it in a long while. You will have to wake it. Pour a little water down the throat of the pump to seal it, and then work the handle, slow and steady, until the line below remembers what it is for." Do not lose patience. Gravity does the work if you let it. She read that last line twice. Gravity does the work if you let it. Below it, in slightly smaller letters, the man had added one more thing. A note to himself, perhaps. Or to her, or to whoever, across all the long years, would one day kneel here in the dark and need it. The water is always there, below the frost, below the trouble, below everything the cold can reach. It does not freeze. It does not give up. It is only waiting for someone with the patience to call it back. Her eyes stung. She did not have time to weep. She took the last of the melted snow, the precious little that remained, and she carried it to the rusted pump on the east wall. Her hands were shaking, and not only from the cold. She poured the water down the throat of the pump, the way the page had told her, sealing the dry old metal. And then she took the handle in both hands, and she began to work it. It fought her. It was stiff with rust and long disuse, and the first dozen strokes brought nothing but a dry, grinding wheeze, the sound of a thing that had forgotten its own purpose. Her arms burned. Her breath came hard, and behind her, by the fire, the gray-faced man had gone so quiet that she had to glance back twice to be sure he was still breathing. "Come on," she whispered, to the pump, to the line, to the dead man who had built it. "Come on. You didn't do all this for nothing. You didn't leave all this for me to fail at it now." She worked the handle harder, slow and steady and stubborn, the way the page had said. Not panic, not force, patience. Gravity does the work, if you let it. And then, deep in the wall, deep in the buried line, somewhere down below where the frost could reach, something shifted, a gurgle, a cough, a low, rising sound, like a sleeper drawing the first breath of waking, and water came. It came out of the rusted spout in a dark, threading rush, splashing into the pot she'd set beneath it, cold and clear and alive. Water that had not frozen. Water that had been there all along, patient, below the trouble, below the cold, below everything. Just waiting for someone with the will to call it back. She let out a sound that was half a laugh and half a sob. She did not stop to celebrate. She filled the pot and she set it to warm at the edge of the stove, and within minutes she had something hot pressing into the cold man's hands, lifting it to his lips, making him drink whether he wanted to or not. "Drink," she told him. "You came all the way up here to save somebody. Let somebody save you for once." He drank, and slowly, so slowly that at first she did not dare to believe it. The gray began to leave his face. The shivering returned, hard and ragged, and she had never been so glad to see anything in her life, because shivering meant fighting, and fighting meant living. The waxy gray gave way to a raw red flush. His eyes, which had gone distant and dull, found her face again and stayed there. She kept the fire high. She kept the warm water coming. She kept him talking, made him answer her, dragged him back, hour by hour, from the quiet edge he'd been sliding toward. And the storm screamed on outside and could not have her. Somewhere in the deepest part of that night, while the man dozed at last in true sleep instead of the dangerous false kind, she sat beside him with the book open on her knees, and she kept reading, not for instructions this time, just to hear the voice, just to keep herself company. Through the long dark hours of watching over a sleeping man and a guttering fire. And it was then, near the back of the book, on a page she had not yet reached, that she found the thing that explained all the rest of it. The handwriting here was different, still careful, still patient, but shakier, older. The hand of a man writing something he had carried for a very long time and had finally decided to set down. The page told a story. Long before the cabin was a refuge, the words said, it was only a place a man went to be alone, to get away from the world and from the people in it, and from a grief he could not outrun. Because once, in a winter much like this one, a young traveler had come up this mountain, a girl, barely grown, lost and cold, and far from anyone who loved her. She had knocked on a door, somewhere down in the lower country, looking for shelter from the storm, and the man behind that door had turned her away. Not from cruelty, the page said, from caution, from the 1,000 small reasons people use to keep a stranger on the wrong side of a door. She was not his problem. The storm was not his fault. Someone else would surely help her. No one else did. They found her the next morning, the words said simply, not far from the door that had stayed closed. And the man who had closed it could never, for the rest of his days, close his eyes without seeing her face. She lowered the book. Her hands were shaking. So that was it. That was the whole of it. The fire always laid. The door without a lock. The careful words left for strangers. The lifetime of quiet kindness set out year after year for people he would never meet. It was not generosity, exactly. It was atonement. A man had failed once to open a door, and he had spent the rest of his life making sure that no one who ever came to this one, no lost girl, no half-frozen traveler, no soul the world had turned away, would ever again find it closed. She read the last line on the page through a blur of tears. If you are reading this, the man had written, then you are the one I built it all for. I could not save her, so I have tried instead to save you. Whoever you are, whatever they have told you that you are never too small to be worth a fire in the dark. She pressed the book to her chest and bowed her head and wept quietly in the firelight, while the storm howled on and the old man slept, and the whole cabin held its 2 living souls safe in the dark. She had thought she had stumbled into this place by accident. She had thought she was nobody, a girl no one had wanted, a problem in a hallway, a verdict spoken through a half-closed door. But she had been the answer to a grief she never knew existed. Somewhere, long ago, a man had failed to save a girl very much like her. And every careful thing he had done since, every fire and every word, and every act of patience left waiting in the dark, had been reaching across all that time toward this exact moment, toward her, toward a frozen, doubted, unwanted girl who needed, more than she needed anything in the world, to be told that she had always been worth saving. She was not an accident. She was the whole point. When she lifted her head at last, the old man was awake. He was watching her from the bunk, his color come back, his eyes clear, and she did not know how long he had been lying there in the firelight, watching her weep over the dead man's book. You found it, he said quietly. The part about the girl. She nodded, not trusting her voice. He told me once, the man said. The only time he ever spoke of it. The one thing that could make Amos go quiet. He was silent for a moment. Now you know why he never asked a single question. Why he just opened the door. Why didn't you keep it? She asked. The words came out softer than an accusation, but they were one all the same. He gave you your whole life back. He asked for one thing. Why did you let it all fall to ruin? The man closed his eyes, and when he spoke, his voice was the voice of someone setting down a weight he had carried so long he'd forgotten how to stand without it. Because I was ashamed, he said. Because every time I thought about coming back up here and tending this place, I had to face the kind of man he was, and the kind of man I wasn't. He failed once and spent his whole life making it right. And I just failed, over and over, and told myself there'd be time to fix it later. He opened his eyes, and they were wet. And then one day I was old, and the time was gone, and the work was rotting, and there was nothing left to do but feel bad about it, which costs nothing and changes nothing. The fire snapped between them. And then tonight, he went on, I climbed up here, half dead, ready to find his life's work in ruins. And instead, I found you. He looked at her then, really looked at her, the way the old woman used to, the way almost no one ever had. You did what I couldn't, he said. You found this place falling apart, and you didn't just shelter in it. You kept it. You sealed the seams and tended the fire and woke the water back up out of a frozen line, with nothing to go on but a dead man's handwriting and your own 2 hands. His voice broke. I spent my whole life deciding who was strong before they ever said a word, and I was wrong about almost every one of them, starting with you. The one I took one look at and wrote off the second I came through that door. She could not speak. I'm sorry, he said, for what I said, for what I thought. You're not what I called you. You're not anything they ever called you. He shook his head slowly, wonderingly. You're the realest thing I've seen in 20 years. And there it was. The thing she'd been starving for her entire life, without ever letting herself know how badly she wanted it. To be seen, to be looked at by another person and found, not lacking, not too small, not a problem to be solved or a burden to be passed along, but enough, more than enough, worthy of respect from a man who had spent his whole life giving it to almost no one. Something inside her, something that had been clenched tight and cold and frightened for as long as she could remember, finally, slowly, began to come unclenched. She had spent so long believing the verdict. She'll never last on her own. A girl like that. Nothing in her. And here, in a forgotten cabin on a cold mountain, in the heart of the worst storm either of them had ever seen, a hard old man who had no reason to lie to her had looked her in the eye and called her the realest thing he'd seen in 20 years. The voice that had followed her up the mountain, the cruel whisper that had lived in the back of her mind for so long that she'd mistaken it for the truth, went for the first time, completely silent, and in its place there was only the snap of the fire and the breathing of 2 people who had kept each other alive, and the patient presence of a dead man's love resting open on her knees. He'd be proud of you, the man said. Amos, he'd look at what you did here, and he'd be proud. Of both of us, maybe. Me for finally coming back. You for... He gestured around the small bright room, at the sealed seams and the steady fire and the water running where there had been none. For being exactly the one he built it all for. She wiped her face, and she found that she was smiling, even through the tears. Then we should keep it, she said, when the storm breaks. We should keep it ready, the way he wanted, the way you always meant to." The old man was quiet for a long moment, and then, slowly, something eased in his weathered face, something that had been knotted tight for 20 years. "Yeah," he said softly. "Yeah, we should." Outside, the storm raged on through the long, dark hours, but something had changed inside the cabin. The wary truce of two strangers was gone. In its place was something quieter and far stronger. The bond of two people, both shaped by loss, both told too many times what they could not do, who had found each other in the dark and discovered, to their own astonishment, that they were not alone after all. They took turns watching the fire. They drank the clear water from the Woken line, and somewhere in the deepest, coldest hour of that endless night, the girl noticed something she had been too busy to notice before. The wind had changed its voice. The great roar that had pressed against the walls for so long had begun, almost imperceptibly, to ease. The hissing waves of driven snow came softer now, and farther apart. The storm that had settled over the hollow like something that meant to stay forever was beginning, at last, to move on. She crossed to the small window and scratched a clear place in the frost with her thumbnail and looked out. And far off, beyond the thinning snow, low on the eastern edge of the world, there was the faintest gray promise of a light that was not firelight. Dawn was coming. They had made it through. The girl no one believed in, and the man who had stopped believing in himself, had carried each other and a dead man's kindness through the longest night of the mountain's fury. And they had held. The fire had held. The walls had held. And as the first thin light crept up over the ridge and touched the snow-buried hollow with the pale gold of a new and quieter day, the girl stood at the window with the book held against her heart, and she understood that something in her had changed in the night, and would never change back. She had come up this mountain certain she was nobody, and she was going to come down it, if she came down it at all, knowing at last exactly who she was. The morning came soft and gold. It crept up over the ridge while the two of them stood at the small window, watching, and it touched the snow with a light so pure and so quiet that for a long while neither of them could find a single word worth saying. The storm was gone. It had spent its long fury through the night and then moved on, the way even the worst things, in the end, move on. And it had left behind a world made entirely new. The hollow lay buried under a deep, untouched white. The trees stood heavy and still, each branch bowed under its soft burden. The sky had cleared to a high, washed-out blue, the kind that only ever comes after a great storm, as though the whole world had been scrubbed clean and hung out in the cold air to dry. She pushed the door open. The cold came in to meet her. But it was a different cold now, clean and sharp and harmless. The killing edge had gone out of it in the night. She stepped out onto the snow-buried threshold, and she stood there in the new light, and she breathed. She was alive. The girl no one believed in. She had walked into the very worst the mountain could throw at her, and she had not only lived through it, she had carried another soul through it on her back. Behind her, the old man came slowly to the doorway. His color was back. His step was steadier than it had been in the long, dark hours. He looked out at the transformed world with the eyes of a man who had seen a great many such mornings. And yet, he looked at this one as though it were the very first. "A long time," he said quietly. "I told myself I'd come back up here. And it took a storm like that, and a girl like you, to finally drag me." He shook his white-dusted head slowly. "Funny, the way a thing finds you only once you've stopped looking for it." She said nothing. She only stood in the gold light and let the morning fill her up, like water finding its level in a tank that had been empty far too long. The days that followed were quiet ones. The snow lay too deep for travel, and so they stayed. And the staying was no longer a siege. It had become something gentler. The wary truce of two strangers had melted away with the storm, and what was left between them now had the easy, unhurried shape of people who have simply stopped being strangers. The old man recovered a little more of himself each day, and as the strength returned to his hands, he began, at last, to do the thing he had promised a dead man he would do long ago, and never had. He began to keep the cabin. He showed her things the book could not. How to re-chink a wall the old way, working a mixture of clay and dry moss into the gaps with a flat blade until the whistling draft simply died. How to true up a door that had dropped on its hinges over the slow years. How to read the grain of a log and know whether it had another 10 winters left in it, or whether it had begun, quietly, to rot from the inside, the way some things do. And she showed him things too. The seam she had sealed against the worst of the storm. The water line she had woken from its long, frozen sleep. The careful order she kept the place in, every tool returned to its proper spot, every task done in its proper turn, the way the old woman had taught her, the way the book had deepened. "You keep it better than I ever did," he admitted one gray afternoon, watching her work. "Better than I would have, even if I'd kept my word and come back like I swore I would." He was quiet a moment. "Maybe that's why it waited for you. Maybe a place like this knows who it's meant for, and holds on, no matter how long it has to wait." They talked in those long, snowed-in days. He told her about Amos, not just the careful voice in the worn old book, the real man, a big, quiet soul with sad eyes and gentle hands who could mend almost anything and forgive almost anyone, except the one face he saw every time he closed his eyes. A man who had taken a single terrible failure and turned it slowly, patiently, over the whole long remainder of his life, into grace. "He never preached at me," the old man said. "Not once. He just lived it, laid the fire, left the door, kept the words in the book, and trusted that someday it would all reach the person it was meant for." He looked at her, his eyes wet and bright. "Took longer than he ever could have guessed. But it reached you. In the end, girl, it reached you." And she told him about the old woman who had raised her, the rough, warm hands, the low, slow way of speaking, the one person in all the world who had ever looked at a small, unwanted child and seen something worth the keeping. "You're stronger than they think," the old woman used to tell her in the lamplight, on the nights when the world had been cruel. "You just don't know it yet." She was right, the man said simply when she told him. She was right about you. And the strangest thing happened when he said it. It did not hurt. For so long, the memory of that voice had been a kind of wound, a place she could not touch without bleeding. But somewhere in the long night of the storm, something had shifted in her. The grief was still there. It would always be there. But it had stopped being only loss. It had become, instead, a kind of inheritance. The old woman had believed in her, and she had carried that belief, like a single coal kept alive under cold ash, all the way up a frozen mountain and into the heart of a killing storm. And when the moment came, when a man's life hung on it, she had bent down and blown on that coal, and it had caught, and it had burned, and it had kept two souls alive through the dark. The old woman was gone, but what the old woman had given was not gone at all. That was the thing she understood now in those quiet, snowed-in days that she had never understood before. The people who love us do not entirely leave us. They leave something behind in our hands, and what we do with it, whether we let it go cold, or whether we carry it forward and give it away again, that is the whole of it. That is the only thing that has ever truly mattered. The way down finally opened on a still, bright morning, when the snow had settled and hardened enough at last to bear a person's weight. And it was then that the old man made his offer. They stood together outside in the clean cold, looking down the long white slope toward the lower world, and he turned to her, and there was something almost shy in his weathered face. "You don't have to stay up here," he said. "You know that. There's room down below, with me." He cleared his throat, gruff with feeling. "It's nothing grand. An old man's house, gone half empty and too quiet for too many years. But it's warm, and it's dry. And the door—" He paused. "The door would always be open to you. You'd have a place, a real one. The kind you told me there was nothing to go back to." She looked down the slope, down toward the warm world, the world of houses with doors and neighbors and second chances. The thing she had wanted, secretly, desperately, for as long as she could remember. A place, a roof that was hers. Someone who actually wanted her under it. It was everything she had ever been told she would never have, and for one long moment, she very nearly said yes. But then she turned, and she looked back at the cabin, at the small, bright room that had taken her in when she had nowhere else in all the world, at the fire that had been laid for her by a man she would never meet, at the door without a lock, at the worn book on the shelf, and the water running clear from a line that had waited, patient, below the frost, through all the long, cold years, for someone with the will to call it back. And she understood, all at once, what she truly wanted. It was not to be rescued. She had been rescued already. What she wanted now, what she wanted more than warmth, or safety, or a place of her own in the world below, was to become the one who rescued someone else. "No," she said softly. The old man's face fell, just slightly. "I want to stay," she said. "I want to keep it. The way Amos meant it to be kept. The way you always meant to, and never quite could." She looked at him, and her eyes were clear and certain. "Somebody has to keep the fire laid. Somebody has to leave the door unlocked, and the words in the book, and the water running. For whoever comes next. For the next frozen, doubted, unwanted soul who climbs up out of the dark, certain they're nobody, certain the whole world has no use for them." Her voice caught and held. "Somebody has to be here to tell them they were wrong." The old man looked at her for a long, long moment, And then something in that hard, weathered face broke open into the first true, full smile she had ever seen on it. "He'd have loved you," he said quietly. "Amos, he'd have taken one look at you and known he could finally rest, that the keeping was in good hands." He nodded slowly, his eyes shining. "Far better hands than mine ever were." "You'll come back," she said. It was not quite a question. "I'll come back," he promised, and his rough voice cracked on it. "As often as these old legs will still carry me up, to help with the heavy work, to bring you what you can't make for yourself up here." He swallowed. "And to see you. If you'll have an old fool like me darkening your door now and again." "The door's always open," she said, and she meant it with her whole heart. He went down the mountain that morning. She stood on the threshold and watched him go. A slow, dark figure, leaning on his stick, picking his way down across all that white, growing smaller and smaller, until the trees took him, and he was gone. And for the first time in her entire life, when someone walked away from her, it did not feel like being left behind. It felt like the beginning of something. The seasons turned. She did not count them the way she once had, ticking off the days like a prisoner scratching marks into a wall. There was no need anymore. She had stopped measuring her life in how long until the next bad thing came for her. She measured it now in the slow, honest work of keeping a place alive. The snow gave way to a thaw, and the thaw to a green and dripping spring, and the spring to a high summer when the hollow filled with birdsong, and the creek ran loud and laughing down its stony bed. She learned the cabin in every season. She learned it the way you learn a person you have come to love. Its moods, its weak places, the corner that always drafted first when the wind swung around from the north, the board in the floor that creaked a soft greeting when she crossed it in the dark, the way the morning light came through the small window in summer and lay in a warm gold square upon the floor, and the way it slanted, thin and silver, in the deep of winter. She mended what the book and the old man had taught her to mend, and in time she found she was teaching herself things that neither of them had ever known, solving problems in her own way, leaving her own small marks upon the place, the way Amos had left his, the way the old man had left his. The cabin grew, slowly, to fit her hands the way it had once fit theirs. The old man came, as he had promised. He came up in the spring, when the way was clear, leaning a little harder on his stick each year, his hair gone fully white, his step gone slow. He brought her things from the lower world, seed and salt, and good strong rope, and small kindnesses she had never asked for and never quite knew how to thank him for. And every time he would stand in the doorway of that small, bright room, and he would look at the fire she kept, and the order she held, and the whole quiet life she had built in a place he had once let fall to ruin. And every time his old eyes would fill, and a peace she could see would settle a little deeper into him. He had carried his unpaid debt for the better part of his life, and in the end, he had not paid it back to Amos at all. Amos was beyond the reach of any payment. He had paid it forward, to her, and that, she came to understand, watching him grow old and gentle in those visits, was the only way a debt like that could ever truly be settled. You cannot give back what was given to you. The hands that gave it are gone. You can only turn and find someone shivering in the dark behind you, and give it again. There came a spring at last, when he did not come. She watched the slope for him through the long green-gold days, and the way stayed empty, and somewhere in her heart she already knew. And then one quiet morning, a young man she did not recognize climbed the slope in his place, a little out of breath, carrying a small bundle wrapped in cloth and tied with twine. He was kin to the old man, he said, a grandson. He had come a long way to find the cabin the old man had spoken of, again and again, in his final season. The high place, the keeper, the girl who had saved his life in a storm and given him back his peace before the end. He talked about you, the young man said, right up until the last, about the cabin and the fire and the books on the shelf. He said he died square with the world. The young man's voice was thick. He said he finally kept his promise, that you let him. He wanted you to have this. He held out the small bundle. She unwrapped it with careful hands. Inside was the old man's knife, worn smooth, kept sharp, and folded around it a single scrap of paper with a few words on it in a hand that shook, written near the very end of a long life. The words said, only this, keep the fire laid. You were always the right one for it. She stood for a long time in the gold morning light, holding the worn knife and the shaking words. And she let the grief move through her, the way she had learned to let things move through her. It hurt. Of course it hurt. The good things always cost something. The deeper you let someone in, the larger the hole they leave. But underneath the hurt, there was something else, something the old woman had taught her, and Amos had taught her, and now the old man had taught her too, with his whole long life and his quiet, square death. That to grieve someone is only the receipt for having truly loved them. That an empty place at your table is the proof that the chair was once gladly filled. She set the old man's knife on the shelf beside the two worn books, and she went on, keeping the fire. There came an evening in the soft gold of a late autumn when she took down a thing she had been saving for a very long time, a new book. Blank, plain, bound in the same simple way as the old one, its pages empty and patient and waiting. She had carried it up the mountain in her pack all those seasons ago, on the very first day she came, without ever quite knowing why. The way she had carried so many small things she could not afford and could not explain. Habit, instinct. The dim, wordless sense of a need she could not yet name. Now she knew. She sat down at the small worn table in the steady glow of the fire she had kept alive through more storms than she could any longer count, and she opened the new book to its first clean page, and she took up a pencil, and she sharpened it slowly, carefully, the way the man who came before her had once kept his. And she began to write. She wrote the way Amos had written, small, upright, clear, not for herself, for someone else, for someone who was not yet there, for a stranger she would never meet. Whoever finds this, she wrote, you are welcome here. The fire is laid. The roof will hold, if you tend it. There is water in the line, running clear below the frost, only waiting for you to have the patience to call it back. Take what you need, and when at last you go, leave it ready for the next one. She paused there, the pencil resting against the page, and she let her mind go back the way it rarely did anymore. across all the cold miles and the cruel voices and the long years she had spent believing she was nobody at all. She thought of a half-closed door and the small words spoken behind it. She won't last. A girl like that. Nothing in her. And then she thought of another door, one without a lock, and of the man who had left it open for her, across all that distance and all that time, when he could not possibly have known her name or her face, or the long dark road that would bring her to his threshold. And she bent again over the page, and she wrote the words she had needed, more than she had ever needed anything in all the world to hear. "You are not too small for this," she wrote. "You are not too soft, or too young, or too lost, or too late. Whatever they told you, down in the warm and careful world, about all the things you could never be, and all the room you would never be worth taking up, they were wrong. You were always worth a fire in the dark. You always will be. And one day, when you are warm again, and strong again, and whole again, you will understand why someone you never met went to all this trouble for you, and you will pick up a pencil of your own, and you will pass it on. That is the only way the light keeps burning. Not because it cannot go out, but because all down the long years, there has always been someone willing to carry it to the next one." She set the pencil down, and she read it back once in the firelight, and she found that her eyes had filled, not with grief this time, with something fuller, something that had no single name, the strange, deep peace of a wound that has finally, completely closed, and become the very place from which you give. She wound a strip of leather twice around the new book and tied it off in a simple knot, the kind of knot you tie when you expect someone to untie it again themselves, not a knot meant to seal a thing away forever. And she set it on the shelf, 3 books now, leaning together in the corner, 3 careful hands, 3 keepers, across the long span of years, leaving the same quiet promise in the dark for whoever would come after. And then, at last, the years gave her the thing the whole long story had been moving toward, from the very first frozen night. It happened on a wild evening, when the wind had come down hard and screaming off the high country, and the snow flew sideways through the dark, and the whole hollow groaned and shuddered beneath the weight of another great storm. She was older now. Her hands had grown rough and sure and strong. There was gray here and there, woven through her hair. She sat by the fire she had kept for more years than she now troubled to count, mending something small in her lap, listening to the storm fling itself against the walls of the place she had long since made her own. And over the roar of the wind, she heard it. 3 blows on the plank door, heavy, uncertain, spaced too far apart. The knock of someone at the very end of their strength. She set down her mending, and she rose, and she crossed the small bright room, and she did not hesitate, not for a heartbeat, not for the space of a single breath. She lifted the latch. The door swung in on a great blast of cold and driven snow. And there, on the threshold, half falling, wrapped in clothes far too thin for a mountain in the grip of such a night, stood a figure she knew at once. Not by the face. She had never seen the face. By something far deeper than that. A young one, frightened to the bone, frozen nearly through, far, so far from anyone who had ever loved them, The kind of soul the warm world below had looked at and weighed and quietly turned away. A lost child, climbing up out of the dark, with nowhere left in all the wide world to go. She had stood on this very threshold once herself. She knew that look. She knew the bottomless cold behind those eyes. She knew the cruel verdict the young one was carrying up the mountain, folded small and secret in the heart, because it was the same verdict she had once carried up it herself. The one that whispers over and over in the voice of everyone who was ever supposed to love you. You are nobody. You will not last. The world has no use for the likes of you. She reached out, and she drew the frozen child in out of the storm, and she shut the door against the howling dark, and she threw the latch. You're safe now, she said gently. You're safe. Come to the fire. And as she led the shivering young one across the room toward the warmth, she watched those frightened eyes move slowly around the small bright space and stop, the way her own eyes had once stopped so many long years ago, on this same iron stove, in this same corner, on the fire, already laid, the birch bark resting on the grate, the cedar shavings beneath it, the single split of seasoned oak, dark as old leather, waiting only for a single match to wake it, laid days before, by careful hands, not for herself, for a stranger she would never meet. The young one stared at it, and then turned to look up at her, and in that frozen, frightened face, she saw the dawning of the same impossible question that had once dawned in her own heart, on her own first night, in this very room. Someone left this. For me? Someone, somewhere, thought of me? She smiled, and she nodded toward the shelf where the 3 books leaned together in the corner, bound in worn leather, waiting. There are some stories up there, she said softly. 3 of them now. About the ones who kept this place before you came, about what it cost them, and about what, in the end, it gave them back. Her voice was warm and low and certain as the fire. When you've thawed out and you've eaten and you can hold a thought in your head again, you should read them, all 3. The young one looked at the books and then back at her, with eyes that were just beginning, against all odds, to hope. Why? The child whispered through chattering teeth. Why would anyone do all this, leave all this, for somebody they don't even know? And the keeper of the cabin, the girl no one had ever believed in, who had once walked up into a storm, certain she was nobody, and had walked back out of it knowing, at last, exactly who she was, knelt down beside the fire that had saved her, in the small warm room that had taken her in, and gave the answer that had been handed to her across all the long years, the answer she had finally grown old enough, and whole enough, and strong enough to give. Because once, she said gently, somebody did it for me, when I was just like you, frozen and frightened, and sure the world was through with me. She brushed the snow from the young one's hair with a rough, tender hand. And once, long before that, somebody did it for him. And someday... She looked into the frightened young face in the firelight, the next keeper, though neither of them could know it yet. The one who would one day stand at the same door on another wild and screaming night and open it without hesitating for another lost soul climbing up out of the dark. And someday, she said, when you're warm and strong and ready, you'll do it for someone too. That's all it is. That's the whole secret. We just keep handing it down. The young one began, very quietly, to cry. Not from cold. From the simple, overwhelming, almost unbearable relief of it. The relief of being, after so long, and so much, and so far, finally, completely, taken in. And she held the shivering child by the fire, and she let them cry, and she did not say another word, because some things do not need words. Some things only need a warm room, and a steady fire, and another human soul who has decided, freely and fully, that you are worth the trouble. Outside, the storm howled on through the long, dark hours, but it could not get in. Inside the small forgotten cabin on the cold and ancient mountain, the fire burned warm and low and steady, the way it always had, the way now it always would, passed from hand to hand to hand, down all the long, unbroken years, like a single careful flame carried gently through a very long night, by people who had each, in their turn, been certain they were nobody, and had each, in their turn, been wrong. A light left on, for whoever comes next.